popular Christian teaching on the Psalms has sometimes categorized certain psalms as imprecatory psalms. The word imprecatory describes something that calls down curses or divine punishment on someone or something. However, it's actually more accurate to talk about imprecatory passages or sections within complaint psalms, since no psalm in the Psalter is entirely imprecatory. Rather, as Brueggemann shows, imprecation serves a larger purpose as a vital part of a complaint directed to God. When directed to God, imprecation is a call for justice or for protection. Many modern Christians and many modern non-Christians who have been subconsciously shaped by Christianity far more than they tend to realize are uncomfortable with the imprecatory passages in the Psalms. Perhaps this is part of the discomfort Brueggemann observes that prosperous Western Christians feel towards the negative emotions in the Psalms of disorientation. Brueggemann suggests that Christians who live relatively easy lives in economic and political terms are more likely to gravitate towards Psalms of orientation, where everything is okay and orderly. To whatever extent that may be true, however, I think there is often something more than just economics or culture at the heart of the discomfort modern Christians feel when, for example, Psalm 17:13 through 14 says, "Rise up, O Lord, confront them, overthrow them. By your sword deliver my life from the wicked, from mortals. By your hand, O Lord, from mortals whose portion in life is in this world. May their bellies be filled with what you have stored up for them. May their children have more than enough. May they leave something over to their little ones." Or when Psalm 3:7 says, "Rise up, O Lord, deliver me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek, you break the teeth of the wicked." In fact, many feel that there is a theological incongruity between imprecatory sentiments in the Psalms, such as these, and the ethics of the Sermon on the Mount. Whereas Psalm 3 says, "You strike all my enemies on the cheek," Jesus says in Matthew 5:39 and 44, "If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those that persecute you." Now, on the basis of this important passage, imprecation, it is sometimes thought, is just a part of the past, a relic of progressive revelation, an imperfection in Old Testament religion that has been left behind by Jesus' transcendent kingdom ethics. But is it correct to posit such a stark contrast between Old Testament and New Testament religion? Isn't this yet another example of incipient Marcionism? The fact is that the New Testament itself contains examples of imprecatory prayers or sentiments. In Revelation 6:9 through 10, the souls of the martyrs, those who lived the turn the other cheek ethic to the fullest possible extent, cry out to God, "Sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long will it be before you judge and avenge our blood on the inhabitants of the earth?" When Paul says in Romans 3:8, "Their condemnation is deserved," is this not essentially imprecatory sentiment expressed as a statement rather than as a wish? Something we also see in the Psalms, as in Psalm 3:7. The same can be said for 2 Timothy 4:14. "Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. The Lord will pay him back for his deeds." If we are going to censor imprecatory portions of the Old Testament because of their apparent contradiction with Jesus' turn the other cheek ethic, then we must also cut out those same portions of the New Testament. However, a careful reading of Old Testament imprecatory passages reveals that they are often more compatible with the transcendent kingdom ethics of Jesus than it may at first appear. Or, put another way, Jesus' kingdom ethics prove on close examination to be not so much a progression beyond Old Testament ethics as really a perfected realization of them. This is because built into the typical complaint psalm is a movement through complaint into faithful resolution. Or using Brueggemann's terms, psalms of disorientation are usually better understood as psalms of movement through disorientation into reorientation, because they do not consist exclusively of pleas, but they move from plea to praise. For example, look at Brueggemann's discussion on pages 32 and following. Now, let us consider Psalm 3. Psalm 3 is a good example of a complaint psalm, though its praise portion is more substantial than its plea portion, and it goes back and forth between plea and praise rather than simply progressing from plea to praise. Even so, the emotional state of the singer of Psalm 3 does not simply dwell in complaint, nor does it move from orientation to disorientation. Instead, it is moving through disorientation into reorientation. It is moving through complaint into a statement of faith that God will deliver the singer from his or her enemies. A vital part of that movement is calling upon God to execute justice on the singer's enemies. It is noteworthy that the imprecatory portions of the Psalms are always directed towards God and always expect God to be the one who brings about justice. In other words, they say, God, execute justice on my enemies, and not, God, enable me to execute justice on my enemies. And the latter is actually precisely what Samson prays in Judges 16:28. In Psalm 3:7, not only is the imprecation directed to God, it is immediately followed by a declaration of faith that deliverance, that is, the execution of justice, belongs to the jurisdiction of God alone. And as we read the imprecatory portions of the other complaint psalms, we see that this is not something unique to Psalm 3, but rather is typical of Hebrew complaint psalms. These are not self-aggrandizing psalms that encourage vigilante vengeance or justify patterns of retaliation. They are pleas for justice to the judge of all the earth and acknowledgments of a unique divine jurisdiction in the realm of justice. It is this differentiation between divine and human jurisdictions that is really at the heart of Jesus' turn the other cheek ethic in Matthew 5:38 through 48. Jesus is not saying that we should not desire justice or that God is not interested in justice, but that justice is God's jurisdiction and that God is faithful and competent to execute justice in the most just way possible, whereas human vengeance generally tends to miss the mark somehow and adds injustice to injustice. Jesus teaches us that when we give up our claim to exact vengeance on our enemies and trust God to vindicate us and to execute justice on evildoers, we are liberated to pray for our enemies and to build bridges, ultimately with the hope that they might realize their evil and repent. This is not a contradiction of the imprecation of the complaint psalms, but a perfect distillation of their message of faith. Now, I would go even further and suggest that it is vital for us to allow ourselves to speak the imprecatory speech of the complaint psalms if we want to live according to Jesus' turn the other cheek ethic. What imprecation does is give expression to the horror of injustice. It names injustice for what it is. When we do not allow ourselves to express imprecation, to call upon God to punish evildoers, what we are doing is censoring our emotions, constantly dancing around injustice rather than identifying it, and so, in a sense, downplaying the evil of injustice. We're pretending that we can ignore it. Without giving ourselves the right to verbalize injustice, whether against us individually or against our community, we actually inhibit our progression beyond imprecation and make it difficult or even impossible to live according to the turn the other cheek ethic. By denying rather than naming the evil, we ironically find ourselves stuck emotionally in the anger of victimization, rather than progressing beyond it into real forgiveness and liberation from that victimization. Before we can forgive our enemies and pray for God to show them mercy, there must be an acknowledged offense to forgive. Otherwise, we're simply pretending that no offense was ever committed. Imprecation, in other words, is the foundation for meaningful prayer for mercy for our enemy. But it is not just any imprecation that lays this foundation. Clearly, our negative emotions are very powerful and can threaten to overwhelm us. That's part of the reason they scare us. If only there were some divinely authorized way to express our negative emotions. That's precisely what the complaint psalms give us. Divinely authorized imprecations set within songs that move us from plea to praise, from imprecation into faithful relinquishment of our vengeful emotions to the judge of all the earth. Walter Brueggemann is absolutely right when he talks about the spiritual impoverishment of a church that shies away from the negative emotions within the Psalms of disorientation. The path of true spiritual growth is necessarily and by design through the discomfort of disorientation, which is the dialogue between faith statements and the apparent incongruity of lived experience with these statements, into a new and better orientation, which is really a more nuanced and accurate understanding of our original faith statements rather than a rejection of them.